The Phoenix Suns have been one of the most exciting teams in the NBA over the last 8 months. They make the trade for Kevin Durant, they bring in Bradley Beal in the offseason, all these other moves around these guys, this star-studded team that looked like a contender coming into the season. However, they've been one of the most disappointing teams in the league to begin the year, and interestingly for Kevin Durant at least, we have seen this exact same story before. Now what I mean by that is there are a remarkable amount of similarities of this Phoenix team compared to the Nets team that Kevin Durant requested a trade from in the first place. The team that 6 months ago, 7 months ago, whatever it was, he wanted to leave that team and somehow has ended up on basically an exact replica of that team in Phoenix. Now, everybody expected this season to take some time to really come together for the Suns this year. They were relying on two older guys that have had injury issues recently in Kevin Durant and Bradley Beal. They made a ton of changes to the roster. They have a new coach. Change was the name of the game in Phoenix. And anytime that happens, it's going to take some time to really figure things out, to figure out who you are as a team. But now, with Bradley Beal suffering an injury and a disheartening start to the season for Phoenix, it's interesting to think about how similar this situation is to what Durant left in Brooklyn. Because when you look back on those Nets teams, not the James Harden version, not the team that in my opinion should have beaten Milwaukee and should have won the title had they been fully healthy the year that the Bucks won the title, not that version of the team. That's the version of the Nets that I think the Suns thought they were going to be coming into the year. We haven't really gotten a chance to see them at full strength, so that's a hard comparison. The one you can compare it to, though, is the team that Durant directly requested a trade from. The Durant, Kyrie, Ben Simmons not playing, all that other stuff, that version of the Nets is extremely similar to what we have right now in Phoenix for a couple of different reasons. Obviously, it's a very top-heavy group. It's a team that doesn't have a ton of role players, doesn't have a ton of depth, has a little bit of shooting outside of the main guys, but there's a ton of reliance on the main players, on the stars. And that's not abnormal for a lot of NBA teams, but the ways in which the Suns rely on their stars is eerily similar to what we saw in Brooklyn. And first and foremost for them is kind of just what it looks like when you have Kevin Durant on your team. Now, to be clear, Durant is obviously an unbelievable offensive player still at this point. There was a point in the year at the beginning of the year last year where I thought Kevin Durant should have been getting some hype for potential MVP votes. Like, that's how good he still is even at his age. But the shot profile of your team is going to look a specific way when you've had Kevin Durant on your team over the last couple of seasons. Generally speaking, Kevin Durant teams are not near the top 10 of the league or the top 5 in the league in terms of three-point attempts. You're a very mid-range heavy team. You rely on a lot of tough twos. And even though, yeah, you get to the free throw line a good amount, shot making is what is required in order to win basketball games on a night-to-night basis. Not just when you have Kevin Durant on your team, but when you build things the way that the Nets did then and the Suns have now. And that is their main flaw. It's their biggest flaw, because on certain nights when you're making shots, when everything's going in, you can look like a team that can beat anybody. You look like a team that is just incredibly talented. All the stars are clicking. And on any given night, you can beat any team. You can beat Denver. You can beat any of the contenders around the league. But on the other hand, as we saw recently, you also can lose to any team on any given night, because your only path towards being a good to great team is with really good shot making. And if you go into a game on one particular night where you're not making shots, you can lose to any team, any night. And everything that I just said could be said about those Kyrie KD Nets teams, as well as the current version of the Suns. On a night-to-night basis, the pathway to the Suns being a good to great team and winning a lot of games and winning games, especially against great competition, is to make a ton of tough twos, to get to the line a good amount, and have their role player guys make enough threes. They're not going to have a high volume of threes. They're not going to guard extremely well. They're not going to rebound extremely well. There's no real way for this team or that Nets team to win games ugly. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Phoenix knew that coming into the season. They knew that they were going to need Kevin Durant, Bradley Beal, and Devin Booker to all play extremely well for them to potentially compete for a title this season. That's the way that they built their roster. But it's interesting to see how similar those Nets teams were to this current Suns team, because Durant specifically requested to go to this Phoenix team, and then of course they traded for Beal afterwards. And I think that coming into the year, the Suns thought, or theoretically, and they still can be, by the way, the sky is not falling in Phoenix even after losing to Portland. They thought that they were going to more closely resemble the James Harden, Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving trio in Brooklyn rather than just KD and Kyrie, because they added in Bradley Beal to this mix. Bradley Beal was supposed to be the James Harden to Kevin Durant and Devin Booker's Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. That was the plan. And that team in Brooklyn, just by the way, just so we're 100% clear, is one of the most talented and devastating offensive teams that we've seen in the NBA ever. When those guys were healthy, when they were right, they were destroying teams. In that series that they lost against the Bucks in the playoffs, it was almost a no contest through the first couple of games of that series, because you always had two of KD, Kyrie, or James Harden out there on the floor in a playoff series in which your rotation is shorter, and teams just couldn't guard those guys. And as a theoretical team, emulating that in Phoenix with Beal, Booker, and Durant, that made a ton of sense, and it still can make sense depending on the health moving forward of this team. And ironically, the thing that undid that Nets team as well was also health. However, as we saw in Brooklyn, if one of those guys gets hurt, or if your shot making is off from game to game, this is an extremely vulnerable Suns team on a night-to-night basis. Kevin Durant can drop 40, Devin Booker can have an off night and they can lose. Both those guys can have 25 pretty efficiently and they can lose because their role players don't knock down enough shots. They don't have margin for error when it comes to missing shots. And obviously, when you look around the league, most teams are not going to win a ton of games if they're not shooting the basketball well. Making shots, scoring more points than the other team is a critical component of winning basketball games. Everybody knows that and everybody understands that. But those Nets teams and this Suns teams are pushing that to the limit. But there is an upside to that, because in a theoretical universe in which Bradley Beal, Devin Booker, and Kevin Durant are all healthy at the beginning of the postseason, I absolutely would not want any part of playing that team. With the amount of shot making, especially guys like Durant and Booker that have been known for being really, really good in close games in the playoffs. Durant was unbelievable in that series against Milwaukee, where they still almost won despite no Kyrie and a hobbled James Harden. Those guys are terrifying in a postseason series. And then when you add Beal to the mix, I could totally still see them as a conference finals contending team. And I'm not making this video to say that everything is over for Phoenix just because they lost to Portland and because Beal's hurt. If those guys are healthy, I want no part of them in a playoff series. And it would make total sense for Durant to have forced his way to Phoenix in a scenario in which Beal is there and he's healthy, because that team resembles the KD, Kyrie, Harden version of the Nets that, as I said, was just unbelievably terrifying. But it is interesting to think about a guy in Durant that kind of made his own team in Brooklyn, wanted to separate himself from the Golden State titles, win a title on his own, and then force his way to Phoenix because he, one, didn't want to be in Brooklyn anymore. Kyrie requested the trade, but also just wanted to have a better chance at winning a title, and he thought that's what Phoenix represented. And it's interesting to see him now almost in real time struggling with and realizing that without Beal and with this current version of the Suns, he's basically on the exact same team. It's a team that doesn't have a ton of future because they've given up all their picks the way that the Nets did. It's a team that doesn't have great wing role players. It's a team that relies on shot making and star power. And by the way, it's a team that can still be great, because the thing that I haven't mentioned this entire video is before KD and Kyrie got traded, before KD hurt his knee, that Nets team won almost 20 games in a row. And so if you are, in a groove and you're hitting shots on a night-to-night basis, the Suns can still be an absolutely devastating team. But it requires, at this point, a healthy Bradley Beal, and it requires shot making the same way that the Nets required health and they required shot making as well. And at this point in the year, through 25 or 30 games, it's becoming unclear whether or not Phoenix is going to be able to reach those thresholds of shot making and health. And again, they're basically the exact same as those Nets teams from last year and a couple years ago.